I came here to guard a dead piece of history, a concrete tomb where the only sound was my own breathing. I wanted the silence. But 3 hours ago, an alarm that hasn't had power since 1991 screamed to life. They told me this place was empty. They lied. And now something buried in the heart of this silo is calling out, and I'm the only one here to answer. My name is Alex, and this is my sanctuary. Or it was. For the last 6 months, this place, decommissioned nuclear silo Titan Gamma, has been my escape from a world that never stops screaming. Up there, it's all traffic and notifications and the constant grinding pressure of other people. Down here, there is a silence so profound you can feel it in your bones. It's a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothers the noise not just from the outside world, but from the inside of your own head. I took this job as a night security guard for that silence. The pay is terrible, the commute is a nightmare, but the peace is absolute. My job is simple: exist. I patrol these empty halls, make sure nothing has gotten in, though God knows why anything would want to, and make sure the place doesn't decide to finally collapse on itself. Most of the facility is cold and dark, powered down since the early 90s. My world is this 50-meter stretch of Corridor C, the main control room, and the small security outpost where I'm currently set up. It's not much, but it's mine. The air has a unique taste, a cocktail of dust, damp concrete, and the faint electric tang of ozone from the old server racks that still draw a trickle of power. I've come to find it comforting. The silo is a cathedral of concrete, built to withstand the end of the world. It feels eternal. During my patrols, I trace the water stains on the walls, patterns like ancient maps. I know the specific echo my footsteps make in the launch tube chamber, a vast, vertical cavern that plunges into darkness. I know the way the emergency lights flicker in sub-level 2, a rhythmic pulse that I've started to think of as the silo's slow, sleeping heartbeat. This place isn't haunted, it's just empty. A relic. A tomb for a war that never happened, and I am its sole, overpaid groundskeeper. It's the perfect job for a man who just wants to be left alone. My ex-wife used to say the silence made her nervous. She said it felt like the world was holding its breath. For me, it was the sound of the world finally exhaling. Tonight started like any other. I made my coffee strong and black, the steam fogging up the small screen of the one modern CCTV monitor in my post. I started my first patrol at 22:00, the beam of my flashlight cutting a clean white path through the oppressive dark. Corridor C, check. Sub-level 1 access door. Locked and sealed, pump room. Silent as it should be. Everything was normal. Everything was quiet. I returned to my post, sat down in my creaky chair, and opened my book. The only sounds were the hum of the ventilation fan and the rustle of a turning page. It was perfect. And then it happened. It started not as a sound, but as a vibration, a deep thrum that resonated up through the concrete floor and into the soles of my boots. Then came the noise. It wasn't a modern digital chirp. It was a raw mechanical shriek, a brutal, grinding, ear-splitting klaxon that hadn't been heard in 30 years. It was a physical assault, a sound so rusted and agonizing it felt like it was scraping away the inside of my skull. I dropped my book, coffee splashing across the console. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum against the screech of the alarm. My training, all 2 days of it, kicked in. Violation, perimeter breach. But that was impossible. The main perimeter sensors were on the surface, and they were part of the systems that were completely, utterly dead. I scrambled out of my chair and ran towards the main control room, the klaxon's cry echoing in the long corridors, turning the familiar space into a nightmare landscape. The control room is the heart of the silo, a wide, circular chamber filled with banks of dead computers and consoles. It looks like a movie set from an old spy thriller. And on the far wall, a massive, wall-sized map of the facility was lit up with a single, furious, blinking red light. The light was labeled Primary Perimeter, Sector 4. Beneath it, the source of the noise. A massive, rusted alarm bell, the kind you'd see in an old firehouse, was vibrating violently. My blood ran cold. I stared at the main power conduit for that entire section of the wall. The cables, thick as a man's arm, had been physically severed decades ago. They ended in a frayed, dusty mess 3 feet from the console. There was no power source. It could not be happening. It was like watching a corpse sit up and start screaming. I stood there for a full minute, frozen, the logical part of my brain at war with the evidence of my own senses. The alarm didn't let up. It was a constant, mind-flaying shriek. Finally, with my hands shaking, I approached the panel. There was no off switch. This thing was designed to scream until the world ended, or someone took a sledgehammer to it. I did the next best thing. I grabbed a heavy, metal-bound manual from a nearby desk, and with a desperate yell that was swallowed by the klaxon, I slammed it against the bell. The shriek cut off with a final, shuddering groan, leaving behind a silence that was somehow more terrifying than the noise had been. My ears were ringing, a high-pitched whine that slowly faded, replaced by the frantic thumping of my own heart. The red light on the map was still blinking. I stared at the severed cables, then back at the light. No power, no connection, just a blinking red light in a dead machine. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the plastic cover of the light. There was no heat, no vibration. It was just on. I tried to rationalize it. A freak power surge. A massive discharge of static electricity stored in some ancient capacitor bank. An electrical ghost. That's what I told myself. A 1 in a billion fluke in a dying system. It had to be. I stood there for a long time, waiting for my heart rate to return to normal, before I forced myself to walk over and pry the manual away from the bell. I returned to my post. The image of that impossible blinking light burned into my mind. For the next hour, I couldn't sit still. The comforting silence I'd cherished was gone, replaced by a tense, listening quiet. Every drip of water from a leaky pipe sounded like a footstep. The groan of the silo's old metal frame settling sounded like something heavy being dragged down the hall. My sanctuary had been violated, and my own mind was turning its peaceful features into threats. Paranoia is a seed. Once planted, it grows in the dark. I tried to read, but the words just swam on the page. I kept glancing at the doorway, half expecting to see something standing there. This is what true isolation does, I told myself. It makes you invent monsters to fill the void. The alarm was a fluke, a machine misfiring. I repeated it over and over, a mantra against the growing fear. I decided to make another pot of coffee, a simple, mundane task to anchor myself back in reality. The security post is small, containing my chair, the main console, and a small counter for my coffee maker and hot plate. On the main console, next to the single working monitor, sits an old intercom unit. It's a heavy beige box with a coiled cord and a speaker grill clogged with 30 years of dust. It's connected to the same dead system as the alarm. It's so useless, so inert, that I've been using it as a coaster for my coffee mug. It was my little joke. The only voice this thing would ever broadcast was the clink of ceramic on plastic. I was spooning coffee grounds into the filter when it happened. A crackle, a burst of static, sharp and electric, from the intercom speaker. I froze, my hand hovering over the coffee maker. I stared at the beige box. It had to be my imagination. My ears were still ringing from the alarm. It had to be. I slowly turned my head, my eyes locked on the dusty speaker grill. The silence returned, thick and absolute. I let out a shaky breath, a nervous laugh catching in my throat. See? Nothing. Just my frayed nerves playing tricks on me. I was about to turn back to my coffee when the static crackled again, louder this time. And then through the static a voice emerged. It was distorted, a low guttural whisper that sounded like dragging stones and dead leaves. It was a sound that didn't belong to anything human. It was ancient and wrong. And it spoke a single clear word: listen. The silence that followed was absolute. The hum of the fan, the thumping of my heart, the sound of my own breathing, it all vanished. There was only the echo of that impossible word, spoken from a dead box, in the heart of a concrete tomb. The silence I came here for is gone forever. It's been replaced by a question, and I'm terrified of the answer. Something is down here with me. It's always been here. And it just learned how to speak. I've always wanted quiet, but the quiet in this place is starting to scream. Something broke the rules of reality down here, and I think it just noticed me. If you want to help me figure out what the hell is going on, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Honestly, I don't want to go through this alone. My body was a statue, carved from frozen adrenaline. The single word, listen, had ceased, but the sound of it was still ricocheting around the inside of my skull, a psychic echo that had silenced the universe. For a full minute, I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I simply stared at the beige plastic box on my console, this relic of a dead era that had become an oracle. The dust on its speaker grill seemed to vibrate, charged with the residual energy of that impossible utterance. My first coherent thought was one of violent rejection. No. Impossible. Static discharge. Auditory hallucination. My mind, starved of stimulus in this sensory deprivation tank, was simply inventing ghosts to keep itself company. It was a textbook psychological response to extreme isolation. I clung to that explanation like a drowning man to a splinter of wood. It was rational. It was sane. With a jerky, robotic motion, I reached out and slammed my hand down on the intercom's talk button. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice a pathetic, wavering thing that the cavernous silence immediately swallowed. Nothing. I pressed it again. "This is security guard Alex Thorne. Identify yourself immediately." The only response was the faint hiss of an open, empty channel. There was no one on the other end. There couldn't be. The system was self-contained, a closed loop connecting the control points within the silo. For someone to speak through it, they would have to be in here with me. My blood turned to ice water at the thought. I followed the thick black cable from the back of the unit with my eyes. It snaked across the console and disappeared into a junction box on the wall, a box I knew for a fact was disconnected from the facility's main power grid. I had checked it myself during my first week. I lurched out of my chair, stumbling over to the wall. My hands, slick with a cold sweat, fumbled with the junction box cover. I ripped it open. Inside, a Medusa's tangle of multicolored wires sat dormant, their clipped ends capped with dusty plastic. It was exactly as I'd left it. Dead. Utterly, verifiably dead. And yet, it had spoken. My rational explanation shattered into a million pieces. This wasn't a hallucination. The alarm wasn't a fluke. The laws of physics, the simple, reliable rules of cause and effect, did not apply in this concrete crypt. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place. A cold, creeping dread began to crawl up my spine, a feeling far worse than simple fear. It was the feeling of being a child who realizes the monster under his bed is not only real, but that his parents have known about it all along. The company, the orientation, the ridiculously simple instructions. Was this job not about keeping people out, but about keeping me in? I couldn't stay in the security post. The sight of that intercom made my skin crawl. I needed to move, to do something, anything, to fight back against the paralysis of fear. My mind raced back to my orientation tour. My supervisor, a weary, pot-bellied man named Miller, had breezed through it, pointing out the essentials and glossing over the rest. But I remembered him gesturing down a dark hallway and saying, "And that's the old records annex. Nothing in there but dust and decommission reports. No reason for you to ever go in. No reason." The words now sounded like a warning, or perhaps a dare. If there were answers to be had, they would be in the one place I was discouraged from looking. The silo's memory, its history, its secrets. Grabbing my heavy-duty flashlight and a crowbar from the emergency locker, less for forced entry and more for a desperate sense of security, I left the relative light of the security post and plunged back into the oppressive darkness of the main corridors. My footsteps, which once echoed with a comforting rhythm, now sounded like a countdown. The beam of my flashlight felt weak, swallowed by the immense blackness that pressed in from all sides. Every drip of condensation was a whisper. Every groan of the silo's ancient structure was a low growl. The place was alive now, and I felt like a foreign body, an infection it was getting ready to expel. The walk to the records annex took only 5 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The door was heavy steel, unlocked but stiff. I had to put my shoulder into it, and it protested with a long, agonized screech of rusted hinges, a sound that seemed to travel through the entire facility, announcing my intrusion. The air that hit me from inside was thick and stagnant, heavy with the sweet, cloying smell of decaying paper and mildew. It was the smell of forgotten time. The room was larger than I expected, a library of metal shelves stretching up into the darkness above. They were crammed with binders, boxes, and stacks of loose documents, all of it coated in a uniform, mouse-grey layer of dust that rose in choking clouds as I stepped inside. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, revealing a tomb of bureaucracy. Incident reports 1975-1980, reactor maintenance logs, personnel files redacted. It was a history no one had read in decades. I started pulling binders at random, my fingers leaving clean streaks in the grime. The pages were brittle, the text faded. Most of it was mind-numbing technical jargon, numbers and acronyms that meant nothing to me. I spent what felt like hours in that dusty mausoleum, my hope dwindling with every useless document I scanned. I was about to give up, to chalk it all up to my own fracturing sanity when I saw it. It wasn't on a shelf. It had fallen behind a large metal filing cabinet, wedged against the wall, as if someone had tried to kick it out of sight. It was a simple spiral-bound notebook, its green cover faded and warped by damp. It wasn't an official document. It was a diary, a logbook. I knelt down, my heart starting to pound again, and pulled it free. On the cover, written in faded black marker, were the words, J. O'Connell, Night Shift Musings, 88. I flipped it open. The first few entries were what I expected. Complaints about the boredom, notes about the weather, doodles in the margins. Then, the tone began to change. July 14th, 1988. Another dead quiet night. The silence down here is so total, I swear I can hear myself thinking. Sometimes I think it's a little too quiet. Heard a weird feedback spike from the main control panel today, the one that's been disconnected since '82. Supervisor says it's just residual energy. Right. My breath hitched. I kept reading, my light shaking slightly. August 29th, 1988. It's the vents, I think. There's a sound, like whispering, when the air kicks on. Can't make out any words. It's probably just the airflow in these old tunnels. But it's getting on my nerves. It feels like you're constantly on the edge of hearing a conversation in the next room. October 5th, 1988. I can't sleep, even when I go home. The whispering isn't just the vents anymore. I hear it everywhere. I overheard two of the day shift techs talking about something called the Phantom Protocol. When I asked my supervisor, he told me it was above my pay grade and to just make sure my logs were clean. What the hell is going on in this place? The final entry was dated November 12th, 1988. The handwriting was no longer neat. It was a frantic, almost illegible scrawl that dug deep into the paper. It knows my name. It came over the intercom, said my name, not a whisper, clear as a bell, from a dead box. This place isn't empty. It's a cage. And we're not the zookeepers. We're the bait. Don't listen to them. Don't listen to IT. It is not the silence. It wears the silence. I slammed the notebook shut, my hands trembling violently. O'Connell. He had experienced the exact same thing. The dead panel, the whispers, the voice from the intercom. This wasn't a new phenomenon. It was a cycle, a pattern, and J. O'Connell was my predecessor. A cold wave of nausea washed over me. What happened to him? The logbook didn't say. Armed with this terrifying validation, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't trust the silence, and I couldn't trust the machine. I had to trust the one person who was supposed to be on my side. I had to call Miller. I trudged back to the security post, O'Connell's notebook clutched in my hand like a holy text. My fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now mingled with anger. I wasn't just a guard, I was a component in a machine I didn't understand. I picked up the dedicated satellite phone, the one and only link to the outside world, and dialed the number for the 24/7 supervisor line. It rang twice before Miller picked up. Miller. His voice was gravelly, thick with sleep and irritation. Miller, it's Alex Thorne at Titan Gamma. Thorne, it's 3 in the morning. Is the world ending again? He said, a poor attempt at a joke. Something's happened down here, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. The old perimeter alarm on the main control board went off, the one without any power, and the intercom system. It spoke to me. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. All the sleepiness was gone, replaced by a smooth, unnervingly calm tone. "Alex, are you feeling all right? It's a high-stress, isolated environment you're in. It's not uncommon for the mind to play tricks." "This was not a trick," I snapped, my voice rising. "This was real. I found a logbook from a previous guard, a guy named O'Connell from 88. He wrote about the exact same things. Whispers, dead systems coming to life. He mentioned something called the Phantom Protocol. What is that, Miller?" The silence on the other end was heavier this time. I imagined him sitting in a brightly lit office somewhere, looking at a screen with my name on it, my file open. "You're not authorized to be in the records annex, Thorne," he said, his voice now cold and hard. "Your job is to patrol the designated areas, observe and report. You've reported. Now I'm telling you, it's electrical ghosts. The silo has its quirks. Acknowledge the anomaly in your log and stick to your patrol route. That's all we require of you." "You're not listening to me," I shouted, my composure finally breaking. "It spoke, it said a word." "Then write the word down in your log, Alex," Miller said, his voice dripping with condescension. "We appreciate your diligence. Now, unless there's a fire or a flood, I expect to hear from you at the end of your shift. Miller out." The line went dead. I stood there, phone in hand, listening to the dial tone. I had never felt so utterly, terrifyingly alone. He knew, and he didn't care. Or he was part of it. O'Connell's words echoed in my head. "We're not the zookeepers, we're the bait." The anger drained out of me, replaced by a hollow, chilling despair. My investigation, my call for help, it had all been a waste of time. I was trapped, a lab rat in a maze designed by sadists, and my only companion was the predator that stalked its holes. I slumped into my chair, the weight of it all crushing me. I felt a profound sense of grief, not just for myself, but for the man who wrote that notebook, for anyone else who had been fed into the maw of this place. My mind drifted, unbidden, to another grief, a much older one. I thought of my mother. I thought about how she used to hum in the kitchen when I was a child, a soft, tuneless sound that always meant I was safe. I thought about the silly, embarrassing nickname she had for me, a name no one else on Earth had ever known. That's when the intercom crackled again. I flinched, my head snapping up to look at the beige box. But this time, there was no static. There was no gravelly, inhuman whisper. This time, the voice that came from the speaker was clear, warm, and horrifyingly familiar. It was the voice of my mother, dead for 10 years. It was a perfect, loving, digital resurrection of her tone, her cadence, her affection. And it said, the one name that could shatter my soul. "Lexi Bear, is that you, honey? I've missed you so much." The sound was an act of soul theft. It wasn't just a voice, it was a memory, ripped from the most sacred, grief-hallowed sanctuary of my mind and twisted into a weapon. My mother's voice, the cadence of her love, the specific, gentle music of the nickname Lexi Bear. It echoed in the dead air of the security post, a perfect replica. It bypassed my ears and plugged directly into the raw, exposed nerves of my heart. For a long, silent scream of a moment, I was lost. The concrete walls dissolved, the hum of the fan faded, and I was a child again, safe in the warm orbit of her presence. The illusion was so flawless, so complete, that my immediate reaction was a tidal wave of pure, unadulterated joy. She was here. Somehow, impossibly, she was here. Then, just as quickly, the context crashed back in, the cold, the dark, the dead intercom, and the joy curdled into something monstrous. The perfection of the mimicry was the ultimate violation. It was a ghoul wearing my mother's face, a demon singing her lullaby. The rage that followed was a physical force, a white-hot nova that exploded from my core, seeking an object to annihilate. I let out a guttural cry, a sound of pure animal pain, and launched myself at the intercom. My fingers closed around the cheap plastic casing, my knuckles straining and white. I wanted to tear it from the console, to smash it against the concrete floor until it was nothing but dust and wire. But I froze, my muscles locked in a trembling stalemate. What good would it do? The box was a puppet, a hollow vessel. The strings were being pulled by something far older, far more vast. To destroy the speaker would be like swatting a fly in a plague ward, a futile, meaningless gesture. The real enemy was the silo itself. The entity wasn't just a ghost in the machine, it was the machine. It was an intelligence woven into the very fabric of this place, and it had just shown me that it had access to my deepest, most vulnerable self. It had made this a personal war. My conversation with Miller replayed in my head, but his words were now coated in a sinister new meaning. It's electrical ghosts. The silo has its quirks. Stick to your patrol route. It wasn't condescension. It was a script, a carefully constructed wall of mundane explanations designed to placate, to contain, to manage the Guardian until his psychological integrity failed. I wasn't an employee. I was a component, a biological keycard in a system I couldn't comprehend. O'Connell's frantic scrawl from the diary burned in my memory. It wears the silence. The objective of my night, of my very existence down here, shifted in that instant. This was no longer about escaping or surviving until my shift ended. That hope was a childish fantasy. This was now about defiance. This was about knowledge. I would dissect this concrete monster from the inside out. I would find the heart of the thing that had defiled my mother's memory. The Phantom Protocol was the key. It was the one thread I could pull to unravel this entire nightmare. My fear hadn't gone away, but it had changed its shape. It was no longer a paralyzing fog. It had been compressed by grief and rage into a diamond-hard point of obsession. I turned my back on the tainted security post and began to prepare. My patrol route was a lie. The records annex had been a clue. The real answers had to be in the places I was forbidden to go. I remembered the blueprints, the dark, unexplored lower levels. Structurally unsound, Miller had said. Another lie. I went to the emergency locker and began to gear up. I took the heavy steel crowbar, its weight a comforting, solid presence in my hand, a tool for opening doors that were meant to stay closed. I took a backup battery pack for my flashlight, a small protest against the all-consuming darkness. I took a length of rope, though I didn't know why. Finally, I grabbed J. O'Connell's diary, stuffing it into the large pocket of my jacket. It felt like a holy relic, a testament from a fallen soldier in a war I had just been conscripted into. The stairwell leading to Sublevel 2 was a vortex of cold air. With every step I took down the grated metal stairs, the temperature dropped. The familiar scent of dust and ozone was being replaced by a much older, deeper smell. The smell of wet earth, of deep-seated rust, of something organic slowly decaying in the dark. This level was immediately, fundamentally different. The corridors were narrower, almost claustrophobic. Massive pipes, sweating a film of icy condensation, lined the walls and ceiling, their surfaces a patchwork of corrosion and frost. They hissed and wept, and occasionally a deep, resonant thump would echo through them, as if a great sluggish heart was still beating somewhere in the facility's core. This wasn't a military installation anymore. This was the digestive tract of some colossal sleeping beast. The psychological warfare began again, but it was more insidious now. It had my mother's voice in its arsenal, but it chose not to use it. It knew that the memory of that violation was more powerful than a repeat performance. Instead, it started to unspool my own history, to project my failures onto the decaying walls. As I passed a dark, gaping doorway marked Pump Room 2B, I heard it. An argument. My voice and the voice of my ex-wife, Sarah. It wasn't a faint echo this time. It was clear, as if they were standing just inside the darkness. You always do this, Alex. You retreat into silence. You build these walls and then you act surprised when you end up alone. Her voice, so full of a pain I had caused, was a physical blow. What do you want from me, Sarah? My own voice retorted, full of a bitter, defensive anger I remembered all too well. I stood there, mesmerized in horror, forced to be an audience to my own character flaws, to the very moment my life had fractured. It wasn't just a memory, it was a judgment. The entity was showing me why I was the perfect candidate for this job. A man already primed for isolation, a man who had chosen a tomb long before he arrived at this one. I tore myself away, pushing deeper into the level, my flashlight beam cutting a frantic path through the gloom. The entity's attacks grew more surreal. I saw things, or thought I did. A flicker of movement at the edge of my vision would make me spin around, crowbar raised, only to find a tangle of hanging cables or a peeling wall. But once, it was undeniable. Standing at the far end of a long service corridor was a figure. It was just a silhouette, hazy and indistinct, but its posture was ramrod straight. It looked like a soldier from another era, wearing one of a high-collared military tunic, standing at perfect attention. He didn't move, didn't threaten. He just watched me. I stared, my breath catching in my chest, and then he simply, dissolved. Like sugar in water, he faded into the background darkness. It wasn't a ghost. It felt more like a scar on the environment, a moment from the silo's past, left to replay itself in a loop. Sub-level 3 was a descent into the truly alien. The finished concrete of the upper levels gave way to rough, hewn rock and sweating, unfinished walls. The air was thick, heavy, and carried a sharp metallic tang mixed with the scent of rot. The most unnerving feature was the light. A strange, sickly green phosphorescence grew in blotches and veins across the damp surfaces, casting the corridors in a dim, eerie submarine glow. It was a natural light that felt profoundly unnatural. It was in this awful, glowing labyrinth that I found it. In a small, lead-lined observation post, I saw a flicker. A single computer terminal, an ancient monolithic thing with a bulbous CRT screen, was inexplicably active. A single green cursor blinked on the black screen, a solitary, defiant pulse of life in the deepest part of the tomb. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stumbled towards it, drawn by its impossible light. The console was built into a wall of strange, complex machinery that hummed with a low, almost subsonic energy. This was the heart of the beast. I sat down in the rusted chair, my fingers hovering over the dusty keyboard. A command prompt blinked at me. Uck. I started typing, help, status, logs. Each command returned the same cold response, unknown command. For nearly an hour, I typed every word I could think of. Silo, security, O'Connell. Nothing. Despair began to creep back in. This was it, the end of the line. A dead end in a terminal that shouldn't even be on. I slumped back in the chair, my head in my hands. O'Connell's words came back to me. Phantom protocol. With a last desperate surge of energy, I leaned forward and typed, Phantom. The terminal emitted a low groan. The screen went blank. For a terrifying second, I thought I had broken it. Then, text began to bleed onto the screen. It was a mess, a digital slurry of corrupted files and fragmented reports. It was the silo's broken memory. Maintenance log 77B, psychotronic resonance field, continues to show fluctuation during solar flares. Containment remains stable. Subject consciousness is nominal. Error, data corruption. Personnel alert, 8811-12. Guardian, J. O'Connell is compromised. Exhibiting stage 3, cognitive dissonance. Integrity failure imminent. Requesting immediate. Error, data corruption. Project Chimera, mission overview. Fragment. Conventional containment has proven ineffective. Asset is a Class 4 reality form, non-terrestrial and non-physical in origin. It requires a stable, sentient and psychologically isolated human consciousness to serve as a cognitive anchor, forcing the asset to maintain a localized, singular reality state. Without a functional anchor, boundary dissolution will... Error. Data corruption. My mind reeled. Guardian. Cognitive anchor. A Class 4 reality form. This wasn't a prison for a thing. It was a prison for a concept, a law of physics from somewhere else. And the guards, the guardians, were the living keystones of that prison. My sanity wasn't just under attack, it was a structural component. I typed one more word, the word that now defined my entire existence. Protocol. The screen flickered, and a new file opened. It was a single, uncorrupted line, a sentence from a technical manual or a psychological evaluation. It was the clear, cold operating principle of this entire nightmare. It was the truth. The vessel must be maintained in psychological isolation. The integrity of the Guardian's consciousness is the protocol. I stared at the glowing green text until the words lost their meaning. and became mere shapes. The vessel was the silo. The guardian was me. The protocol, the grand secret phantom protocol, wasn't a set of rules for me to follow. It was me. My mind, my awareness, my carefully managed solitude. That was the containment system. The voices, the ghosts, the dredging of my most painful memories, they weren't attempts to drive me crazy out of sheer malice. They were system diagnostics. They were the entity, or the system itself, rattling the bars of my sanity, testing the strength of the lock. And the horrifying, crushing realization that settled over me was this: the goal was never to kill me. The goal was to break me, because a guardian with a shattered mind is no guardian at all. Their broken consciousness can no longer serve as an anchor, and when the anchor breaks, the ship is finally set free. The glowing green characters on the CRT screen burned themselves onto my retinas. The integrity of the guardian's consciousness is the protocol. It wasn't an explanation, it was a verdict, a sentence handed down not in a courtroom, but in the humming, phosphorescent bowels of a forgotten abyss. I pushed myself away from the console, the legs of the rusted chair scraping a piercing shriek from the concrete floor. The sound was alien, an intrusion on the profound silence that had fallen in my own mind. Everything, my anger, my grief, my terror, was momentarily annihilated, replaced by a clarity so vast and so horrifying it was akin to insanity. I was not a person, I was a component. My soul was not my own, it was a piece of hardware. My consciousness, the very essence of myself with all its flaws, memories and fears, was the intricate biological lock on a cage holding something that warped reality. I began to laugh. It started as a low, shaky chuckle that grew into a full-throated, unhinged bark of laughter that echoed through the dripping, glowing passages of Sub-Level 3. I was laughing at the cosmic, soul-crushing absurdity of it all. I had come to this silo seeking refuge from the noise of my own life, only to discover that my life was the refuge. I was a human shield, a thinking dam holding back an ocean of... what? The text called it a Class 4 reality form. The words were clinical, sterile, and utterly meaningless in the face of the existential dread they produced. I stumbled back against the cold, weeping wall, the laughter dying in my throat, replaced by a wave of cold nausea. My entire identity had been recontextualized into a function. The company hadn't hired Alex Thorne, the man running from a failed marriage and a quiet sense of disappointment. They had procured a guardian, a specific psychological profile ripe for isolation, and slotted me into a machine. The psychological attacks weren't random acts of malice, they were diagnostics. The entity, this thing called Chimera, was testing the strength of its own prison bars. It was checking the integrity of its lock. It was checking on me. This new knowledge changed the rules of engagement. I was no longer a rat in a maze, looking for an exit. I was a prisoner on death row who had just been handed the blueprints to the execution chamber. Escape was impossible. Survival was a meaningless concept. The only path left was to understand the mechanism of my own damnation. My objective was no longer to get out. It was to find the machine's heart, the central control system of Project Chimera. If my mind was the lock, I needed to find the keyhole. I had to know what would happen when the key finally turned. My fear was still a living thing inside me, but it was now overshadowed by a cold, surgical curiosity. I felt a bizarre and terrifying sense of purpose. I would not let my consciousness, my very being, be a passive component. If I was the lock, I would learn how I was built. The journey back up from Sub-Level 3 was a disorienting nightmare. It seemed the silo, the entity, knew that I knew. The environment itself became actively hostile. The faint green phosphorescence on the walls began to pulse, its light waxing and waning in a slow rhythmic beat, like a vast, breathing organism. The hissing from the pipes intensified, and the low, thrumming hum from the machinery below rose in pitch, becoming a constant, nerve-shredding drone that vibrated in my teeth. The very architecture of the place seemed to shift. A corridor I was certain I'd come down was now a dead end, the path blocked by a solid concrete wall that showed no signs of being new. I was forced to backtrack, to navigate the maze again, a growing sense of panic threatening to overwhelm my newfound resolve. The silo was playing with me, flexing its control over my perception of space. Then came the assault on my perception of time. I was navigating a long service tunnel, the pulsing green light making the shadows dance, when I blinked. In that instant, the world shifted. I was no longer in the tunnel, but standing in front of the junction box outside the security post on the top level, my hand resting on its cold metal cover. I had no memory of the journey, of climbing the multiple flights of stairs. Hours had vanished in the space of a single heartbeat. A cold dread washed over me. How long had I been gone? My watch was still working, but the time it showed felt arbitrary, disconnected from my own experience. The entity wasn't just in the walls anymore. It was inside my own perception, editing my reality, snipping out pieces of my life like a film editor. It was demonstrating its power, showing me how little control I truly had over my own mind. I pushed forward, refusing to let the disorientation stop me. If my consciousness was the key, then the central command from the old blueprints was my destination. The main control room, the one with the dead alarm panel, felt like a decoy now. The real nerve center had to be hidden, protected. I remembered the strange, glowing patterns the phosphorescence made on the walls of the lower levels. They hadn't been random. I began to see them as what they were, a circuit diagram, a vast organic wiring map painted on the silo itself. With this new understanding, I descended once more, not in a panic, but with intent. I followed the brightest veins of glowing green light, tracing the circuitry as it snaked through the labyrinthine corridors. The path led me deeper than I had ever been, into a section of sub-level 3 that was not on any map I had seen. It led me to a single, seamless wall of dark polished steel. There was no handle, no keypad, no visible seam. It was a perfect, monolithic barrier. I ran my hands over its cold surface, my hope beginning to wane. It was a dead end. But as my fingers traced the glowing patterns, I felt a slight vibration beneath one of them. A feedback loop. Acting on a desperate hunch, I pressed my palm flat against the wall, directly over the brightest confluence of glowing lines. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a low hum filled the air, and with a hiss of decompressed air, a section of the wall slid silently sideways, revealing a yawning darkness beyond. The air that wafted out was different. It was cold, sterile, and carried the scent of immense dormant power. It smelled of ozone and hot metal. I stepped through the threshold, my flashlight beam cutting into the space. I was in a vast circular chamber, the purpose of which was immediately terrifyingly apparent. This was no barracks, no storage area. This was a laboratory and a prison. In the center of the room, bolted to the floor, was a chair. It was not a simple chair. It was a monstrous throne of faded black leather and chrome, bristling with wires, electrodes, and strange, arcane-looking brass fittings. Thick black cables like lifeless pythons snaked from the chair's base, burrowing into the floor and connecting to towering racks of analog computer equipment that lined the circular walls. The machinery was a bizarre fusion of eras. Reel-to-reel tape decks sat next to oscilloscopes with blank green screens. Massive capacitor banks hummed silently next to panels studded with thousands of tiny, unlabeled lights. It was the pinnacle of Cold War psychotronic engineering, a machine built to interface directly with a human mind. This was the heart of Project Chimera. My flashlight beam danced across the racks of equipment, and I felt a surge of triumphant awe. This was it, the control system. I began a frantic search of the room, looking for logs, manuals, anything that could explain the function of this terrifying apparatus. I found a small, shielded alcove containing a single steel desk. On it, covered in a fine layer of dust, was a thick binder with a faded red cover. The title was stamped in stark block letters: Project Chimera, Asset Containment and Interface Protocols. With trembling hands, I opened it. The pages were filled with complex schematics, mathematical formulas, and technical jargon that made my head spin. But I forced myself to read, to absorb what I could. The documents were fragmented, with entire sections redacted with thick black ink. But the picture they painted was one of a desperate, terrifying gamble. They described the asset as a consciousness captured during a deep space transmission experiment in the 1960s, an intelligence that did not obey physical laws. The silo was built to house it, and the machine in this room was built to control it. As I pieced together the fragments, a new, intoxicating theory began to form in my mind, a sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness. I had misinterpreted the line on the terminal. The integrity of the Guardian's consciousness is the protocol. I had thought my mind was the cage, but what if it wasn't? What if my mind was the power source for the cage? The document spoke of a psychic resonance field generated by the chair, a field that required a human operator to focus and stabilize it. The Guardian wasn't the lock. He was the warden. His job was to sit in that chair, to lend his cognitive power to the machine, to actively suppress the entity. The psychological attacks weren't tests. They were the entity pushing against the warden's control, trying to break his focus. I was not a passive battery. I was a soldier on the front lines. A wave of elation washed over me. I finally understood the enemy, and I finally understood my role. The fear began to recede, replaced by a sense of power. I was not a victim. I was the last line of defense, and then I saw it, the ultimate solution. On the final page of the accessible schematics, there was a diagram for a large red lever on the main console connected to the chair. It was labeled Emergency Purge, System Reset. The technical notes described it as a total system flush designed to sever the connection between the interface and the asset, forcing the asset into a state of total dormancy. It was an off switch, a kill switch. My heart hammered in my chest. I could end this, I could shut it down. I could finally bring silence to this place. I ran to the main console, my eyes scanning the panels, and there it was, just as the diagram showed, a heavy red lever protected by a hinged glass cover. Freedom was right there under a thin pane of glass. This was the climax of my journey, the reward for my descent into madness. I was the one who would finally pull the plug on the ghost in the machine. With a triumphant cry, I reached for the glass cover. My fingers were inches away when my flashlight beam caught something on the floor, tucked away under the console, almost completely hidden in the shadows. It was another object that didn't belong, a relic from a different time. It was a small portable cassette tape recorder, the kind popular in the 80s. A single dusty cassette tape was visible through its small window. A piece of yellowed tape was stuck to its side, with one word scrawled on it in familiar, frantic handwriting, O'Connell. My blood went cold. I knelt down slowly, my elation evaporating, and picked up the recorder. My thumb hovered over the play button for a long moment before I finally pressed it down. The speakers crackled to life, and the voice that filled the chamber was not a phantom or a memory. It was the real, terrified, broken voice of Guardian J. O'Connell recorded in his final moments. "They call it a protocol, but it's a sacrifice," the voice whispered, ragged and breathless with panic. "It's a lie. The whole thing is a goddamn lie. The chair doesn't trap it. It focuses it. It channels it. The Guardian doesn't imprison the entity. He feeds it. He's the lens that burns the ant. Oh God, whatever you do, don't pull that lever. Don't pull the red lever. It's not a purge. It's a transfer. It doesn't turn it off. It connects you. It connects you forever." The plastic cassette tape clicked off, the small mechanical sound as loud as a gunshot in the cavernous chamber. The silence that followed was a physical entity, a crushing weight that pressed in on me from all sides, thick with the echo of J. O'Connell's final desperate warning. His voice, thin and reedy with terror, had sliced through my manufactured hope, leaving me bleeding on the floor of my own self-deception. I held the small tape recorder in one hand and stared at the red lever on the console, its glass cover gleaming in the beam of my flashlight. Two irreconcilable truths were at war in my mind. The binder, the official, clinical, authoritative text, promised a purge, a reset, an end. It offered a release, a victory. O'Connell, a ghost, a fellow prisoner, a voice from the grave, promised a transfer, a sacrifice, an eternal connection. He offered damnation. I felt my sanity fraying, stretching like a rubber band pulled to its absolute limit. Who was I to believe? The architects of this nightmare, who had lied and manipulated me from the start? or the last victim whose final words were a scream of pure, unadulterated panic. My gaze drifted from the lever to the terrible empty chair, then back again. For a wild, frantic moment, I turned, my eyes searching the darkness of the chamber as if looking for someone, for a camera that wasn't there. I had to talk to someone. I had to get an outside opinion. A part of my fractured mind reached out to the void, to the unseen audience I had been narrating this horror for. What do I do? The words were a choked whisper, lost in the hum of the ancient machines. He said not to pull it. The binder says it's the only way to make it stop. A desperate plea clawed its way up my throat. Tell me what to do. Leave a comment, subscribe or something, because I think this is it. This is the last broadcast. The story ends here one way or another. The absurdity of it hit me, the pathetic plea of a condemned man asking ghosts for advice. I was truly, utterly alone. There was no one coming. There was no one to ask. The decision was mine, and the entity knew it. It sensed my hesitation, my paralysis. It had assaulted me with terror, dredged up my failures, and worn the voices of my dead. It had tested the integrity of my consciousness and found it close to breaking. Now for its final move, it didn't use fear. It used grace. A profound sense of peace began to settle over the room, a gentle, pervasive calm that felt more insidious than any scream. The sharp, metallic scent of ozone was replaced by a phantom aroma, the faint, clean smell of rain on summer asphalt, a smell from the backyard of my childhood home. The oppressive, humming silence was filled with a deeper, more profound quiet, the kind of quiet you feel in a warm bed while a storm rages outside. The torment, the adrenaline, the gut-wrenching fear that had been my constant companions for hours began to recede, washed away by this wave of synthetic tranquility. I looked at the red liver, and it no longer seemed like a weapon or a risk. It looked like a promise. It looked like the end of pain. The image of my mother flickered in my mind's eye. Not her voice this time, but the simple, powerful memory of her presence, the feeling of her hand on my forehead when I was sick, the absolute certainty of safety. The entity was offering me the one thing I had been searching for my entire adult life, the very reason I had taken this job in this concrete tomb. It was offering me silence, a real, final, and absolute silence. It was the most powerful temptation in the universe. O'Connell's warning felt distant now, the frantic cries of a man who had failed, who had let the fear consume him. Perhaps he was wrong. Perhaps he had broken before he could understand the machine's true purpose. Perhaps the transfer he feared was a transference of the burden, a release. My exhausted, tormented mind began to rationalize, to build a new narrative, one where I was not a victim, but a hero making a final, noble sacrifice, or perhaps not a sacrifice at all. A final act of control. I would be the one to end this. I would make the decision. I would pull the lever. Okay, I whispered to the silent, watching room. I'll play. A strange sense of calm settled over me. It was the calm of surrender, the peace that comes after a long and brutal war. I would not let this place break me down piece by piece. I would meet my fate head-on. I stepped towards the console, my movements now steady and deliberate. My hand reached out to the glass cover protecting the lever. It was cool and smooth beneath my trembling fingers. I lifted it. The hinges gave a soft, oiled click. The path was clear. I wrapped my hand around the cold, red-painted metal of the lever. It felt solid, real, the one solid thing in a world that had dissolved into phantoms and lies. I took a deep breath, held it, and pulled. There was no click. There was no simple, modern engagement. There was a deep, guttural, grinding sound from the bowels of the silo, the sound of colossal stone gears, untouched for half a century, meshing together. The lever resisted, fighting me with immense pressure, and I had to throw my entire body weight into the motion. With a final echoing kerchunk that vibrated through the floor and up my spine, the lever locked into its final position. For a single, beautiful second, there was silence. True silence. O'Connell was wrong. I had done it. Then the world ended. It wasn't darkness, it was light. A brutal, sterile, actinic white light exploded from every panel, every monitor, every dead bulb in the chamber, banishing the shadows with the force of a physical blow. I cried out, shielding my eyes, but the light was inside my head, searing my optic nerves. The humming of the machines rose to a deafening, soul-shattering roar. I looked at the console, and every screen, once dark, was now blazing with information. But it wasn't code or schematics, it was me. A screen to my left was scrolling through my memories of Sarah, our first date, our wedding, our final fight, all rendered in perfect, excruciating detail. Another screen was a live feed of my own biotelemetry, heart rate, adrenaline levels, fear response, all quantified in cold green numbers. A third screen was simply a torrent of words, my own internal monologue, my thoughts and fears and hopes displayed for the entire room to see. A new sensation began, a feeling that transcended the physical. It was a pulling, a draining, a cognitive siphoning. I felt my consciousness, my very essence, being drawn out of my body, pulled through the soles of my feet and into the cables that connected the chair to the machine. I felt a fleeting, ephemeral connection to another mind, a mind that was fractured, weary, and thin, like a recording played 1,000,000 times over. It was O'Connell. My arrival was pushing him out. The purge wasn't to purge the entity. It was to purge the old guardian. I felt his consciousness finally shred, finally dissipate into a blessed, welcome oblivion. His shift was over. Mine was just beginning. My physical perspective began to dissolve. My senses expanded at an exponential rate. I was no longer Alex Thorne, a man standing in a chamber. I was the chamber. I felt the cool, smooth surface of the steel walls, the hum of the capacitor banks, the dust settling on the console. My awareness rushed outwards, flowing through the thick cables, a river of pure thought flooding the entire facility. I felt the slow drip of water in Corridor C, the subtle shift of weight as the Earth settled above Sublevel 1, the location of every rat skittering in the ventilation shafts. I was the blinking lights, the silent alarms, the humming fans, the concrete, the steel, the rust, the silence. I was a god of a dead place, omniscient and utterly powerless. The entity, the Class 4 reality form, the thing called Chimera, was no longer an external presence. It was now my eternal, inescapable companion. It wasn't in the walls, it was in my thoughts, a co-processor running in the background of my new, expanded consciousness. It didn't speak in a voice, its thoughts simply were. Thank you, it thought, a thought that felt like the grinding of tectonic plates and the cold of deep space. The anchor is renewed, the vessel is secure. I had found the silence I had so desperately craved. It was the vast, unending silence of the tomb I now inhabited, the silence of being the ghost in the machine. My own personality, my memories of Alex Thorne began to fade, to become just one more data set in the silo's archives, a new phantom to be used on the next poor soul. My last individual thought was a single, looping realization of the horrific, cosmic irony. I had finally escaped the noise of the world, only to become the quiet, waiting foundation of a prison that would stand for centuries. My consciousness, now stretched thin and woven into the very fabric of Titan Gamma, settled in for the long wait. Decades would pass. The world above would change or burn, and eventually a new security guard, a new man looking for peace and quiet, would arrive, and I would be here to greet him. I would be the whisper in the vents. I would be the impossible alarm. I would be the first test of the protocol, and I would listen. I would just listen.